Good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is going to be really wide ranging. It's going to be a lot about energy, natural resources, environment, Indigenous relations, etc. Because we've got the foremost expert in Canada on these topics with Heather Exner-Pirot, who is the Director of Energy, Natural Resources and Environment Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and an unbelievably bright young lady who is very knowledgeable on a lot of these issues, and in addition, a lot of issues in the Arctic, and really understands some Indigenous issues better than anyone I've spoken with in a long, long time. So, Heather, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian. You flatter me. Thanks.
Well, it's not flattery because it's completely accurate and true. So, you've been very prolific in writing a whole bunch of interesting things of late. One of them has been about the importance of nuclear. Tell me why you think nuclear is so important and what have we got to do about it?
Yeah, thanks so much. So one of my roles is with the Business Council of Canada and a strategic advisor there. And they have quite a few members who are involved in uranium and nuclear. Bruce and TC Energy, Cameco, SNC-Lavalin, which is now Aikens-Realis. So we wanted to capture what was happening in this very exciting space, really in the last year and a half, and even more so in the last 6 months, and how important and what a competitive advantage Canada has. Well, there's still some European countries, I would say, Australia, some others that are still maybe dithering when it comes to nuclear, aren't quite sure if they want nuclear. In Canada, we have come to, I would say, a good consensus where Liberals, Conservatives, many provinces, the federal government, Indigenous communities, private industry unions, everyone is coming together and saying, yes, we have this great opportunity in nuclear, not only to produce nuclear power for ourselves to, decarbonize our industry, but also to be leaders in it in terms of uranium fuel, some of the models, SMRs, the old can-dos, the new can-dos. So we have the opportunity as we go into what I think will be a nuclear renaissance to be a leader. And as we go through this energy transition, nuclear will only get more important, and we're poised so well. So just wanted to articulate, some of that competitive advantage that we have.
So we shouldn't have sold off the nuclear Crown Corporation we used to have.
Well, I'm a small C conservative free market person, so it was sold off to SNC-Lavalin, like I say, is now Aikens-Realis. I'll speak about them as Aikens-Realis going on, but actually in the last month they did announce a new can-do model, a new reactor model. So there was, we could spend this whole hour me telling you all the exciting things that have happened in the nuclear space in Canada and globally. Should we have sold it? Well, anyways, we have a private company that's advancing it now. So all's well that ends well.
Nuclear waste, is it still an issue, or have we figured out how to deal with it such that the environmentalists are no longer concerned about it?
The environmentalists might always find ways to be concerned about it, but I have spent quite a bit of time looking into it. And I'm quite satisfied that Canada has a very good plan going forward. The first thing I want to say is that, people think like nuclear waste is this thing that can't be controlled or contained. There's a lot of bad waste in the world from industrial practices, from all kinds of industrial practices. So there isn't something really about nuclear waste that exceeds all other kind of waste we all have to deal with or can't be contained. So right now, the nuclear industry would say this. They're the only industry that knows for pretty much every single gram, every single pound, every single kilogram of waste that they have produced, they have accounted for and have managed. And most industries can't say that. And certainly when you burn fossil fuels, those go into the atmosphere. So they feel like they have a pretty good case that actually they manage waste better than anybody else. But we've been securing it long-term above ground. And now they have a plan, and it'll be pretty exciting in 2024. That there'll be, when I say they, it's the nuclear waste kind of consortium, the consortium of nuclear waste producers together have this group that manages it. And they'll be announcing next year the site for their long-term deep geological depository. So Finland started theirs up this year. So it's kind of, in terms of the nuclear industry globally, it is the gold standard. It's how we think we're going to manage waste. Finland's already doing it. Canada has spent the last 10 years planning for it, is going to choose a spot that, beneath the shield, that is not subject to earthquakes, that is very stable rock, and that the community consents to it, and they will start storing it. It's a mega project, probably I think a $40 or $50 billion over the course of 75 years, mega project that will be in Ontario.
Bruce Power is putting, or the provincial government of Bruce Power putting a couple of $1 billion into what is it, an expansion or refurbishment or both of that development in Ontario. But I hear that small nuclear reactors are the future. Tell me where you think we should be focusing.
Well, we need more energy of all kinds. So it's not an either or. But one of the reasons why we've seen this renaissance in nuclear energy is because some of the traditional problems have bogged down nuclear, just the large size. You need a large site. It takes a long time to build. It's expensive to build. And so for a lot of utilities around the world, they can't even afford on their market cap to build a single nuclear power plant because they're so big and expensive. And so small modular reactors fix some of those problems, that they're smaller, so the 300 megawatts or less. Some of them are even, micro reactors that you might put up north or in Arctic communities up to, 5 megawatts. And so they are modularized, so that you can fabricate them in a factory and then assemble them on site. So you're getting some savings in the process instead of having to do a brand new build, the brand new workforce every single time. And of course, they're reactors, so they're using fission. So the idea is that they'll be easier to site. They'll be faster to build. They'll be cheaper to build. And if you wanted to have more than 300 megawatts, then you just have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 instead of having to build 1 or 2 giant ones. And so that's the beauty, is you can really tailor these small modular reactors to the exact kind of power. And it's not just power. That's the other thing. So nuclear reactors traditionally have been producing electricity, and we know them as power producers. But the new SMRs are using kind of advanced technology where they can produce heat as well. And so, and which for the, the hard to abate industries like cement or steel or mining or the oil sands, where you need that industrial heat before really just coal or natural gas are your best options. Now it's looking like nuclear will be able to provide this high quality industrial heat at, zero carbon.
So uranium, where does it come from? Saskatchewan, Kazakhstan, where?
I love to talk about this, Brian, because I'm from Saskatchewan. I always say this. And when I first got into resource development, Indigenous involvement in resource development, it was uranium in Saskatchewan. That's how I came into this whole field to begin with. So I love to tell everybody that the world's best reserves, highest quality, highest ore grades in the world are in northern Saskatchewan, not the Athabasca Basin. And that I also love to say that, northern Saskatchewan is the Saudi Arabia of uranium in the world.
The Saudi Arabia of uranium.
It is an exquisite marvel of geology, the uranium that we have in northern Saskatchewan, the Athabasca Basin. Let me tell you why. So some of the mines already producing, the world's biggest mine producing, its chemical mine, Cigar Lake, has an ore quality of 17%. Now, what does that mean? Usually you will have in any kind of mine for any kind of ore, maybe 0.5, 1%, maybe 2% would be maximum. Australia has great uranium reserves. They will be at like 0.1% grade of uranium. And so really, northern Saskatchewan's ore grades are 100 times better than those that we're finding in Australia, where they are producing some uranium. So again, Cigar Lake, that the jewel of the chemical uranium industry is the most valuable mine by ton of ore in the world, not for uranium, for any ore in the world, because the ore grade is so concentrated. And so it is cheap. Why do you care about the ore grade? You have less of an impact, less of a footprint. It's more concentrated, easier developed, cheaper, all those things. And so we are producing uranium ore at a very cheap rate that you could do anywhere else. And yet, so Australia, Kazakhstan are the other major producers of uranium. It's a pretty concentrated ore.
And Ontario, no?
We process it. No, so we give you the Saskatchewan uranium and you process it and make it into uranium fuel.
Oh, I thought there were some uranium mines here in Ontario too.
I don't think so. I think you fabricate the fuel, as far as I know. Nunavut has some very good high quality ore grades also. All of which to say is, if you care about energy security, we are so blessed and so lucky that it's Canada and our good friends Australia that have a huge amount of the world's production.
You commented me before about the challenges in getting regulatory approval for mines. Are we doing, from a governmental standpoint, what we need to do in regards to our uranium mines in northern Saskatchewan?
So I give our regulators a very hard time on a lot of things because I think they're slow and it's damaging for energy security and our economy and all that. But I have to say this, The nuclear regulator in Canada, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, is actually a very good world-class regulator. And so my props to them. They often work with companies. The uranium mining is all in Saskatchewan. By rights, it should just be a Saskatchewan approval process, but because it involves uranium and goes into nuclear and there's some sensitivity there, the CNSC does have to approve it and does have a role in regulating it. But I don't, so there are some new mines coming online that the CNSC will need to approve and have gone through the Saskatchewan process. But in general, the CNSC is not a huge roadblock. And in general, it works well as compared to, say, some of the other regulators.
Well, we've been speaking about uranium. We're going to take a break for some messages, come back. I'm going to ask her about coal because she's got a really interesting paper that she's written about coal, which I really found fascinating. Also about diamonds in the Northwest Territories, which I was surprised to learn about. And then, and also, I think you were very critical about electrical batteries and our EV strategy. And so we're going to probably chat about that. And then maybe also a little bit about Indigenous relations and Indigenous equity investments in the critical minerals. Stay with us, everyone. Back in just 2 minutes with Heather Exner-Pirot. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour in Saga 960. We're talking about critical minerals today, Canada's government, provincial governments, our strategy, our economic. We've chatted about uranium, and I want to talk about a couple of other issues in regards to critical minerals. But let's take a step back if we could. We had this Supreme Court case, and you've written about it, that was very critical about the federal government's role in approvals of resource developments, and you came out very strongly on that. Tell me what the case was and what your opinion of it was.
Sure. Well, your listeners will probably remember it as Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines bill, which is a bit of a misnomer because it doesn't affect pipelines all that much. The sector that affected the most was mines, but affected all major projects. So it affects ports, railroads, interprovincial pipelines, oil sands, lots of different things. Anyway, so when the Liberals came into power, they wanted to toughen up the approval regime, the impact assessment regime. And they went what a lot of people at the time, certainly Alberta, thought was overboard in going far too greatly into provincial jurisdiction, because under our constitution, the provinces have the right to govern natural resources. Now, the tricky part is that environment wasn't clearly delineated in the Constitution. So the federal governments and the provinces have kind of split jurisdiction over environment. And that's where you get into this gray zone. So the federal government gave themselves the power to regulate pretty much all major projects if it impacted areas of federal jurisdiction like water or Indigenous peoples, which is everything. Everything impacts water and Indigenous peoples. Implemented this law. In fact, now this is why am I critical of it? It has really decimated investment in the resource extractive industries, but also in other major projects. Also, electricity. If you want that energy transition, then electricity, very difficult to get things built. And if you look at the major projects inventory that Natural Resources Canada puts through, I think we're down about a third in the number of major projects that we have in our inventory that are constructed or planned. So it really dampened economic activity, building of major projects. It just increased a lot of burden. And Alberta did take the federal government to court over it. 9 provinces in total joined it. I think BC didn't in the end. But so it wasn't just an angry Alberta thing. Ontario also didn't like it, and so on and so forth. And in fact, the Supreme Court of Canada did find that the majority of it was unconstitutional. So now where are we at? We have this legislation that is mostly unconstitutional, but the federal government, Ministers Guilbeault and Minister Wilkinson, have saying, oh, we just need to do a little bit of tweaking and it'll be fine. And the provinces are saying, well, the federal court or the Supreme Court found about 90% of it is unconstitutional. So I think you need to be doing a bit more than tweaking, sirs. And of course, as usual in Canada, it's the proponents of these projects that are stuck in the middle, just waiting to see what happens with the regulatory process. So that's where we're at. Still slow. I really feel like the federal government, if they wanted to advance the energy transition, wanted to put forward their critical mineral strategy, they could have taken this as an opportunity to rejig the thing, to reform it, to improve it. And instead, the language they've been using is very much that they just need to do a bit of tweaking. And so we're still in this between the provinces and the feds over who gets to approve projects.
And then 2 weeks ago, you published in the Globe and Mail, of all top-heavy liberal climate policies, electrical vehicle mandates is the worst. Why?
So I've done quite a bit of writing on all the different mandates. So your listeners may be surprised to hear that in general, I do favor carbon pricing as the most efficient mechanism.
Carbon taxes.
There's certainly a role for it. And I can see why consumers, maybe on the consumer side, it's tricky. But for a lot of heavy emitters, I think it is the position that they prefer, actually. If you're going to have climate policy, we need to have climate policy, then just do carbon pricing. What the government has done instead is, and it has had carbon pricing, and then layered on all these mandates on top of it, the inefficient government, top-heavy, government choosing favorites, policies on top of it. So we have the clean fuel regulations, we have the clean electricity standard, we have the emissions cap on oil and gas, a variety of these things. And now for me, the latest one is this electric vehicle mandate. And so they're saying that by 2035, 100% of all sales will have to be EVs. And starting in 2026, you go kind of from 20% to 24%, 28% every year, increasing the number of sales. It puts all of the burden on the auto manufacturers and then by proxy the dealers to sell these things, to get consumers to sell them. But they didn't, as part of this EV mandate, do anything really to make owning an EV easier or cheaper or more convenient. Everyone I know, I want to say this, Brian, everyone I know, and you maybe have one yourself, or you certainly have friends that do, that has an EV, pretty much loves them. And I have nothing against an EV. What the problem is that the people who have an EV right now are higher income, are urban, and usually have their own home where they can have their own charger in the garage at night and can charge at their own convenience. What happens to the people who live in apartment blocks, who rent, who live in rural areas where there are no chargers, or simply can't afford to get an electric vehicle because they are more expensive than internal combustion, certainly on the front end. So the government is imposing these mandates, but there's a large segment of the economy, of the population, that for many reasons does not want or cannot have them. And so again, this is, for me, it's inevitable. This is Econ 101, that this will result in shortages and waiting lists, black market for internal combustion engines, all those things. You cannot control these from the top. You cannot centralize such a large part of our economy. And I don't know why they keep on trying.
And in cold weather, the batteries run out more quickly. And I think what you told me before is that we need 8 times the amount of mining we currently are mining to get enough lithium to create all the batteries.
Well, it's the supply chain. The supply chain doesn't exist. And it's for the batteries. It's for the critical mines upstream of the batteries. It's the mechanics. It's the electricians. We need 25% more electricity. We have been flat for about the last decade in our electricity production. We've never imported more from the United States as we have in the last few months of electricity. So we're not building more because of the Impact Assessment Act. We're not building more mines. We're not building more electrical, projects to actually power these darn things. So there's just, they put the burden as if automakers just have to, sell more. And there's 100 things that have to happen downstream of that, and upstream of that they just, from Ottawa, high rises, they just haven't thought about. So for me, yes, it is, it's a command economy kind of approach that they're taking. In the United States, I want to say this is something different. The Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, has just targeted emissions. And for me, that is what I favor. We are going all in on EVs, but it may very well be, it's very early in the game, that hydrogen cell vehicles are better, or that biofuels are better, that there are other options to lower emissions that are cheaper. And the government is picking and choosing a favorite now, a technology, rather than just focusing on emissions. Just everything is a textbook case of top-heavy centralized government making choices for consumers that consumers don't want.
I did a political show just the other day where we were talking about this topic. I did a doctorate in business. I haven't completed it yet, but I was trying to do a doctorate in business, and I did a thesis on carbon taxes as the best way from a pricing standpoint to impact climate change. And the people I quoted were primarily conservative thinkers, both Canada and the United States, that were very in favor of carbon pricing and carbon taxes as the way to solve the problem, rather than the kind of central mandates that you've talked about. But yet the Conservative Party is all in against it. Doesn't make any sense to me.
It doesn't either. So that's where, again, I feel like the Liberals have gone so far, towards mandates, towards kind of gerrymandering the economy, that there is an identity pushback, that people are against it as a matter of identity. And I don't think these policies help with the energy transition in the long run at all, because it makes people revolt against any kind of climate policy, even the most efficient ones. So I said this, as far as they are pushing the pendulum to the left, we're going to find that the pendulum swings to the right the other way, and that is not good for anybody. And so, yes, I think a more nuanced, climate policy, a more efficient one, less top heavy, less government centralized, that brings people along on this journey instead of forces them, is more sustainable in the long term.
Okay, I got to ask you about another article that you wrote in regards to coal. And I found this really interesting. It was on the Teck Glencore deal, and it's not about, you said, Teck unloading a bad asset. It's about removing the ESG noose from around its neck. And you went on to say there's a parallel universe where a G7 country protects its most exquisite metallurgical coal deposit required to produce a critical material for any advanced economy, energy system, or military, that introduces policy to reshore and build up its domestic steel industry in an era of growing geopolitical turbulence. But the world in 2023 is not this place, and Canada is not that G7 country.
So people have such a reaction to coal, and I agree. We need to get rid of thermal coal. Natural gas is a perfect replacement for it, on the way to nuclear, renewables, or wherever. But people need to appreciate that there are different kinds of coal, and coal has different purposes. And metallurgical coal is a kind of coal that is essential in steel making, and that the vast majority of the world's steel requires metallurgical coal. As a chemical reaction, the coal and the carbon monoxide not only produces the heat, but it produces a chemical reaction that turns iron into steel. And so you cannot get away from, you can go to hydrogen. Maybe one day we'll go to hydrogen, but as we all know, hydrogen is very expensive. 2023 saw the most coal usage ever. We think coal is kind of on the way out. It is not. We saw peak coal last year, and we're likely to see it again this year. And there's, you cannot have an energy transition without steel, and you cannot have steel without metallurgical coal. However, everyone is against coal. If you're trying to get investment on the ESG rankings, coal goes way down. And so Teck, which has made tremendous money off its coal assets, and Glencore, which is the world's biggest coal traders, made tremendous money off its coal assets last year too. Both of them want to parse out their coal assets because it's weighing down on their evaluation. So the price of their stock is low because they have big coal holdings. Investors don't like it, even though they're wildly, wildly profitable. I'm talking about wildly profitable. And so this is the strange situation we're in, where Teck is very profitable because of coal, but its stock price is very low. And we're getting rid of what is an excellent metallurgical coal that we have in BC, that is a low carbon intensity relative to other kinds of coals. So if you need to have steel, you need to have metallurgical coal, you might as well have this stuff. And basically we are allowing it to be sold to foreign, investors, which, if it was copper, if it was potash, if it was uranium, there's no way we would approve it. But because it's bad coal, we're allowing it.
But it sounds to me like this isn't necessarily just government that is having the negative impact here. It's the market, because you're saying the stock prices are down. So the market is deciding as well that that coal is bad.
Absolutely. So absolutely, this isn't the government's fault. It's kind of the ESG movement. And we'll see, this is what's interesting to me though. And it was Mark Carney that said this, is that we are seeing paper decarbonization. And so, Mark Carney has led this movement. Mike Bloomberg too, the former mayor of New York, Bloomberg News, people know him, of financial institutions, investors getting off of carbon intense, commodities. And Mark Carney, at least about a month ago, at least acknowledged that this is leading to paper decarbonization, where people have less holdings, but it's pushing these commodities into private traders or foreign national owned traders. I mean, obviously, the Chinas and the Saudi Arabias, the Aramcos, the CNOOCs. And so the world is not using less coal, but Western financial institutions are just holding less of them. And so we should maybe think, and then we're also, suffocating carbon intense industries like cement or steel that we still actually need because they can't get any investment. Mining also, we need all these mines, but they are carbon intense. They are resource extraction. They don't do well in ESG rankings. So we need to start, and he said this, and I totally agree, working at best in class, even if it's a carbon intense industry or a carbon intense commodity, we probably still need it. Let's support the best in class instead of just saying we are getting rid of this, entire asset wholly. Anyways, Teck was a victim of this. They're going all in on copper, which isn't a terrible idea either. And Glencore is actually going to take Teck's coal assets, wrap them up with their other coal assets, which are dirtier, as to try to clean up their coal holdings to get a better valuation probably later this year.
Sounds like I should buy Glencore and just enjoy the dividends rather than the stock.
This is what's interesting, Brian, is that Glencore, which bought coal assets, had a better stock bump than Teck, which sold them after this deal. So it does seem like there are some investors out there that just want to get the most profits. And I feel like in the long term, that's always what will happen.
We got to take a break for some messages. And when we come back, I'm going to ask Heather about Indigenous investment. She's written a bunch of papers about this, about how it makes sense for companies to invite Indigenous groups into the investment and how it makes sense for Indigenous peoples to benefit from the resource extraction in their area by investing. It sounds like an interesting strategy. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Heather Exner-Pirot from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. She's an expert on natural resources, on minerals, on mines, on Indigenous relations, on the Arctic, etc. Writes very frequently in papers from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, as well as published in newspapers like the Globe and Mail. And I have the pleasure of reading all her articles because they're just excellent. And so thank you, Heather, for that. And I've had the pleasure of interviewing you a few times. And so thank you for that. I'm off to Northern Alberta in 2 weeks to make a presentation to an Indigenous organization about investment. And you've written about this in great detail, about why it makes sense for companies to invest with Indigenous groups, and it makes sense for Indigenous groups to make those investments. Tell me a little bit about why you think this makes sense.
Well, thanks so much for asking this question. There's almost nothing I like to talk about more. And really how I came into this again was kind of Indigenous development, and resource development was always, one of the best opportunities for communities to, generate wealth and prosperity. And it used to be that, how we started off was impact and benefit agreements, where there may be some training or some jobs or some contracts for Indigenous communities that were near a mine or, oil and gas facility, that kind of thing. And then we got more into procurement, and that helped Indigenous businesses grow, where you're trying to procure from Indigenous owned companies. And I will say in the last 5 years, but in the last decade or so, kind of the newest gold standard that doesn't replace all those other things, but is the best wealth generators for Indigenous communities to have equity in the projects that are taking place in their territories near their communities. And in this way, why does everyone like this? Why is this such a great idea? Obviously, for the Indigenous community, they're getting, substantial investment in a major project. They're getting equity. They'll see returns. Being equity owners also affords them more influence over a project, often gives them a seat at the boardroom table, or at least, more information of what's happening with the project. And in many cases gives, kind of annual dividends, regular dividends, that helps the community replace what would otherwise be, government transfers that aren't enough. So for the proponent, why do they like having an Indigenous partner? Is because having an Indigenous equity partner is probably the purest form of consent. That, if they are the partner, they want to see the project succeed. They want to see costs stay down. They want to see the timeline accelerated. They have, as I say, skin in the game. They want the same things out of the project as the proponent, because they are getting, as percentage of the value. So what I wanted to do, this is, such an incredible phenomenon. Canada has been leading the way, is to document how it's happening. That's what I did in the paper. And the backdrop for all this is that Alberta, Ontario, and Saskatchewan have Indigenous equity loan programs. Alberta's has been quite successful, has given out about $500 million in loans. And there's been a lot of lobbying to have the federal government introduce their own. They did announce in the last budget update that they were going to announce in the future. It's just how the Liberals do things. They announce that they'll announce in budget 2024 this program. So there's been a lot of thinking about this. What I want to tell your listeners, Brian, is that being in Alberta, I was very familiar with all the pipeline deals that have happened. Maybe the most attention grabbing. But when I dug down into the numbers, and I found that there's about $10 billion of Indigenous equity in major projects. That actually the biggest category was transmission lines, and a lot of that was in Ontario, and Hydro One is doing some good work there. But for the same reason as pipelines, that these are long linear projects, we call them, that have to transverse over many different territories. And so the proponent needs to get a lot of consent. And the best way to do that is to offer these equity deals. So that's why we're seeing in transmission lines and pipelines. The other thing about those two categories of assets is they usually have a power purchase agreement or a long-term contract. So you know how much, probably for 2 or 3 decades, that asset is going to generate. And that is very stable income, reliable income for the Indigenous nation. Whereas a mine or, a pump jack is very volatile, boom and bust. A pipeline and a transmission line is not. So it's interesting to see where and how Indigenous communities are seeking and are getting equity and what makes sense for them.
So mine's not a pipeline or a big mine. It's just a real estate development deal. But they've invited me to come and present to the council of an Indigenous group. Any suggestions for me? What do I have to look out for? What should I be doing?
Well, this is fantastic. So I was really focused on major projects, but real estate has been another huge opportunity. I actually live on Tsuut'ina Nation Reserve, which is I lease land as part of a little golf course community from the Tsuut'ina. I always say I'm not a settler anymore because I pay him $220 a month. But anyways, we're real estate for if I think of the Squamish, the Tsuut'ina, Whitecap, for some in Ontario, there's quite a few. 6 Nations where they're closer to urban areas and they have really made good man in real estate. And probably I'll want to write a paper on real estate deals too. So I would just say, Brian, that for investors, often these things are negotiated with a 99-year lease, that there's a lot of deals that have been done and has worked out for both sides. My community was 1981, so we just renegotiated our 75-year lease last year. Indigenous Services Canada had a good model, knew how to do it. So I think some people are hesitant to build on Indigenous lands because under the Indian Act, you cannot own property on it as an outsider, and it's hard for them to use that as collateral. And so there are some different constraints of developing real estate on Indigenous lands, but it has been done. It's been being done for 4 or 5 decades, and there's a good process now, and everyone can be a winner.
You wrote a really interesting paper about the end of diamond mines in the Northwest Territories. I didn't even know there were diamonds in the Northwest Territories. What's going on?
So my full disclosure and also my skin in the game here for myself is that my husband works at there's 3 major diamond mines in Northwest Territories. My husband works at the De Beer mine, Gaucho Quay. So 25%, actually I think it's 27% in Northwest
I thought
Territories.
you lived in Calgary.
Well, I do. He flies in, fly out. He's a FIFO as we call it, fly in, fly out 2 weeks. So I get to drink my wine and eat what I want for 2 weeks, and then I'll clean up the house really good tomorrow. Anyways, so there's 3 major mines. They together total 27% of NWT's GDP. So a very significant part of the economy.
That's huge.
It's huge. It's more. I always like to say this. It's more than oil and gas contributes to Alberta's economy.
Just to put it in perspective, if you said 23% of Northwest Territories,
I think it's 27. I think it's 27. If I recall.
And how much would oil and gas be for Alberta? Any idea?
Yeah, I think it's low 20s. It kind of depends on the price of the barrel.
Okay.
Yeah, so a huge aspect, but all mines have lifespans. And we know that these 3 mines will reach the end of their lifespan by 2030. Some of them by 2026, and my husband's Gaucho Quay by 2030. And they will start to curtail production even before then. And so we can see the economy will fall off a cliff. Imagine if all of Alberta's oil and gas was going to stop being produced 2030. But in fact, it has just, not gotten anyone's attention, even Northwest Territories. And they just had an election, which is why I wrote this op-ed with two CEOs of Indigenous owned businesses who have profited greatly from the diamond mining industry and getting into, procurement and mining, that kind of thing, has done very well for Indigenous employees. But it did not figure in the last election. NWT is taking this very sleepily. Ottawa is taking this very sleepily. And it should be, a 3-alarm fire, really, for their economy. So it was just to point out that you guys have a huge problem. You better figure it out. And frankly, people think there's just critical minerals and we can just develop it wherever we want. There are not mining projects in the pipeline that will replace those 3 diamond mines.
Are they looking for more? Are they looked and there's no more diamonds available, or what's going on?
Well, so the diamonds reach their end of lifespan, but it is true in the diamond industry in particular, lab grown diamonds have started to become much cheaper. And a lot of it is not really used for rings. It's used for industrial purposes because diamonds are so hard. And lab grown diamonds are anyways replacing the market. So it's just easier to lab grow them than, and frankly, Northwest Territories is a very high cost jurisdiction. Although it has an exquisite kimberlite resource, it's a high cost jurisdiction. So they'll reach their end and they have no interest at diamond prices today in extending the lifespan. So that's part of it. But this is what I want to highlight. Why diamond mines in Northwest Territories is because you don't need a lot of infrastructure to get diamonds out, because they are a small quantity for a high value quality or quantity ratio. And so they have a winter road for 2 months of the year, but they can fly out the diamonds, because diamonds are so small, they do some minor processing on site. This is why it would be very difficult to do a copper mine or an iron mine or a nickel mine in the middle of the Northwest Territories, where you don't have transmission, you don't have roads, you don't have the infrastructure. And so diamonds, precious metals, those are your best bets for the Canadian Arctic. And this was, a great 20 years. But there's nothing kind of in line to replace it. It is a huge problem for the territory. It's a huge problem for all the Indigenous workers who've been trained up, develop businesses, do a couple $100 million in procurement and spending, and have developed that capacity. And now it just feels like you've increased that capacity in Indigenous businesses and workers. And now where will they go after this?
Oh, 27% of your economy disappearing in 7 years or 6 years. Pretty scary.
Yeah, there'll be some remediation for a few years. And so some jobs and but in terms of, the contribution to GDP, I mean, those are costs. Remediation is a cost. It's not an export per se. So yeah, it's a huge problem. If it was any other jurisdiction, we'd all care a lot more.
Then you posted about airships being the future. Airships were like before World War II, weren't they? What's this about airships?
Okay, so when people think of airships, they just think of the Hindenburg. And I know that, and I used to be that person. They're just like, the Hindenburg, why would you bring back the Hindenburg? So I get that that's where people are at, but there are many compelling reasons to bring back the airship. One is that the technology is better. So the reason why the Hindenburg, was vulnerable and blew down, was dangerous,
blew down. I thought it blew up.
Yeah, it was hydrogen. It was hydrogen, basically a hydrogen bomb in the air. But we have better tech anyway. So you can do hydrogen. We have we're trying to build a hydrogen economy. You can do it in a much safer way with sensors and better materials, that kind of thing. Why would you want to use airships? The number one reason, Brian, is that they are air cargo at almost zero. You can do it almost zero carbon, because you can use a hydrogen fuel cell, or you could even use solar panels on the damn things, and they use a lifting gas, helium or hydrogen, where instead of using, combustion to power up to move. So they are a far carbon friendly, climate friendly type of air cargo than our air cargo we have now. Basically the physics of it is just the more helium or the more hydrogen, the more you can lift and the more it can carry. And so it can do a lot of tons, much more than, a Hercules could do. You just make a bigger airship. Why do I care? I just talked about diamonds. So most of the Arctic has no infrastructure, has no roads. A lot of the problem, this from Ring of Fire. The big problem with Ring of Fire is building the road to get to the place. Another linear project, you go through a lot of territories, is impact on caribou, on peatlands, all these things. An airship can be a pretty competitive transportation and cargo opportunity where you don't have roads. And so why do I care? If we want to get some critical minerals out so we can build EVs, even, we're going to need some EVs, even if it's not 100%. So we can have this energy transition, have renewables, have electrification. We need more critical minerals, don't want to depend on China. Maybe airships are a good solution for mining companies, and then for anyone who needs cargo in the north where you don't have good infrastructure. Another paper we published, wasn't me, but was an Alaskan grad student who also serves in the military, on how it could be used for homeland security. Basically, there's no limit to how much surveillance equipment an airship could carry. You can just imagine it going back and forth with the Northwest Passage. With all
like the Chinese weather balloons.
Exactly. Only better and smarter. Now, how close is this? This is actually close to happening. This is what I want to convey and finish off with. The government of Quebec has actually invested in a French airship company, Flying Whales. They are doing, some tests and some
Flying whales.
Yes, that's what they're called, with Air North. So they have very much in mind Arctic, and mining operations is very much a premier target market for them. And Sergey Brin, who your listeners might know is one of the founders of Google, he's doing this for humanitarian purposes. Again, if you go to a place that just had an earthquake or some kind of, other disaster where you don't have any infrastructure, these airships don't even have to land. They can be like flying, cranes, basically. They don't need really any infrastructure on the other end. So he's developing it. It actually just had its first test flight, I think about 6 weeks ago, in the San Francisco area, in the Bay Area, of his airship. LTA is the company. So there are a few airship companies. It's getting closer. There's, it was regulated. They got the license to be able to test this over San Francisco. So we are getting closer. There are some great use cases. They have an economic case. Private money is flowing in. That's why I'm so hopeful.
Heather, you're amazing. Unbelievable. The wealth of your, the breadth of your knowledge, the depth of it and the wealth of it is incredible. We're going to come back after just 2 minutes, and I'm going to have one last question for you. Who is Canada's Policymaker of the Year? Stay with us, everyone, and you'll hear what Heather's got to say about Canada's Policymaker of the Year. Someone who's ruthless, reckless, and damaging. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've been having a lot of fun listening to Heather Exner-Pirot telling us about how many things our government are doing wrong and how many things we got to do right if we're going to meet our future in regards to climate change and critical minerals and things like that. But I've got to ask her at the end about an article she wrote about the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Policymaker of the Year, who she described as ruthless, reckless, damaging. The Honorable Stephen Guilbeault, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
And you go on to say, Guilbeault has treated the fact that Canada is a democracy, a market economy, and a federation as inconveniences to be overcome. The Liberals have been chided for focusing on communications over substance, for announcing policies rather than implementing them, but there is an exception to this rule. The ruthlessly efficient Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault. No one else in Canada has been as influential, and in my view, no one else has done so much damage. Really? You don't hold back, do you?
I mean, this was on the spicier side for sure, but yeah, when am I being fair? I try not to be personal, but he has put together a number of policies, pancaked. We call them these pancake regulations, one on top of the other, that is costing our economy tens of billions of dollars. That is very, very damaging in my mind. And like I say, for many reasons, I don't think it's going to be successful anyways. It's going to result in backlash and the pendulum swinging right. And he's gone, and again, people complain about Scott Moe's, Saskatchewan First, or Danielle Smith's, Alberta Sovereignty Law. It is two of Environment and Climate Change in Canada, Stephen Guilbeault's department, that have had unconstitutional laws this year, laws that the federal courts determined were unconstitutional. So it was spicy, but it is, I think, fair because the damage to the economy, the disregard for the Constitution, and this is, I believe that we need to address climate change, but also we still need a strong economy. We still need economic development. And I feel like Guilbeault is, almost the epitome of the person who only sees the world through a climate change lens, where nothing else matters. not the Constitution, not federalism, not economic development, not the deficit. Nothing else matters because, as they say, like, he's a true believer. I think he probably, believes that we're all going to die in a fiery hell by 2100 if he doesn't, negotiate with China on getting more renewables, all these kinds of things. But that's not the only thing that matters in this country and in this nation and in this world. And I think we need some more balance. And I feel like Guilbeault was the perfect exemplar of the liberals, disregarding reality, in favor of their preferred ideology in their bubbles. And that's how I wrote that. So the policymaker was tongue in cheek, the most influential, I would say, policymaker, but not in a good way.
You go on to say in your article, at the time of his appointment, Guilbeault appeared as the perfect villain, a caricature of the West-hating anti-oil liberal that has confounded the aspirations of Canadians west of the Laurentian corridor for decades. In the last 2 years, he has disappointed few of his supporters and assuaged none of his critics' fears. Pretty good article. Interesting. And you know what? I think he would be wise if he listened to you.
This is what I'll be focusing on 2024. Might as well do our New Year's resolutions, Brian. But as I say, I do believe in climate action. I do believe in some carbon pricing. And I think industry does as well. And we'd all do well to start holding down the center of these policies, of our economic policies and our climate policies, because the pendulum and the polarization is too much. Guilbeault was representative of it. I could name some people on the right who are representative of that as well. And we have to have a stronger center in Canada for us to succeed. And so that's what I'll be working on this year.
I couldn't agree more. A strong center. Heather Exner-Pirot of the Macdonald Institute, thank you so much for joining us again. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Brian. Thanks.
That's our show for tonight. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Alberta, at www.saga960am.ca. My podcasts and videos are available after my radio show goes to air on my website, briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody. Thank you very much, Heather. Happy New Year.
You too.